The fluorescent lights buzzed like cicadas trapped in a plastic cage. 4:47 in the morning, and Danielle Ross was already 3 steps ahead of everyone else. She moved through Oak Creek Memorial's ICU like a ghost, present but unnoticed, efficient but unremarkable. 3 years of arriving before dawn. 3 years of keeping her head down. 3 years of being exactly what everyone expected, just another nurse. She pulled the foot tray toward her station with one hand, her movements economical and practiced, the kind of precision that came from doing something 1,000 times under conditions that mattered. The 18-gauge catheter needle gleamed under the overhead lights. She'd already prepped the alcohol swab, the tourniquet, the saline flush, everything in order, everything ready. Her long-sleeved scrubs clung slightly to her forearms despite the air conditioning, hiding the scars that ran in jagged lines from wrist to elbow. Some scars told stories. Hers told stories she wasn't supposed to tell. The ICU came alive in measured increments. A ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm from bed 3. Monitor cables snaked across stainless steel rails like black serpents. A nurse's aide she didn't know nodded as he passed, and Danielle nodded back, the minimum gesture required to be human without being memorable. She preferred it that way. Memorable was dangerous. Memorable meant questions. By 6:15, the day shift was arriving. Danielle had already completed her patient assessments, charted vitals for 4 post-surgical cases, and run the blood cultures from the sepsis protocols. She moved between beds with the kind of calm that came from already surviving the worst. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers when she adjusted a patient's central line, checking the dressing with eyes that miss nothing. Infection control. Pressure readings. Fluid balance. These were the measurements of a life being held together. One of the newer nurses, Rebecca, watched from across the unit. "How do you do that?" she asked, her voice carrying the kind of awe that made Danielle's chest tighten. "Do what?" Danielle said quietly, never looking up from her work. "Prep and 4 in like 5 seconds flat. You don't even look at your hands anymore. Muscle memory. 1,000 field insertions under conditions she couldn't discuss. Hands that had once worked by moonlight in a Helmand Province compound, improvising with whatever medical supplies hadn't been destroyed in the firefight. But Danielle just smiled and said, "Practice." At 6:45, Dr. Sterling swept into the ICU like a man who owned the building, which, in every way that mattered, he did. 15 years building relationships with every board member at Oak Creek. 15 years making sure that certain people understood the hierarchy, and certain other people understood their place at the bottom of it. He was tall, silver-haired at 53, the kind of handsome that aged into authority. His badge read Chief of Surgery. His expression read untouchable. His eyes moved across the unit in a methodical scan. Bed 1, post-op cardiac, stable. Bed 2, sepsis protocol, marginal. Bed 3, recovery track, promising. He glanced at the nurse stations without really seeing the people behind them. Danielle was repositioning a patient's pillows, her movements efficient and practiced. Dr. Sterling's gaze passed over her like light through water. Morning rounds in 30 minutes, he announced to no one in particular. Everyone heard it. Danielle continued working. She didn't need to be told twice. She didn't need to be told once. She'd learned long ago that the quietest person in the room was the one least likely to be noticed making mistakes. By 10 in the morning, the unit had settled into its rhythm. 2 admissions, 1 discharge, 3 patient updates. The steady hum of a hospital doing what hospitals do, holding the line between here and gone. Danielle was at the supply station refilling her crash cart when Rebecca appeared beside her with an expression that suggested someone had told her something important. "New admission," Rebecca said. "Navy captain. Post-surgical complications from Portsmouth Naval Medical. Room 4. Danielle's hands didn't pause. She'd trained herself out of reactive responses decades ago. "Post-op how long?" 5 days. Fever spiked this morning, and his surgical sites showing some inflammation. Infection protocol. Already started blood cultures. Dr. Hendricks is putting him on empiric antibiotics pending results. Danielle nodded. Another patient. Another set of vitals to monitor. Another person whose life hung on the decisions made in rooms like this. She'd learned not to attach significance to any single case. That way lay the kind of exhaustion that broke people. But when she walked into room 4 with her assessment clipboard, something shifted. Captain James Whitmore was somewhere in his 50s, with the kind of military bearing that didn't fade just because you were lying in a hospital bed. His shoulders were broad under the thin cotton gown. His eyes were alert despite the pain lines around them. He watched her enter the room with the focus of someone trained to assess threats and assets. "Good morning, Captain," Danielle said, her voice pitched to the register that worked best in hospitals: professional, warm, forgettable. "I'm Danielle. I'm going to be monitoring your vitals today. How's your pain level?" "Manageable," he said. His voice was rough with sleep deprivation. "When can I get this for changed?" "It was placed in Portsmouth 5 days ago." Standard protocol was 48 hours maximum before removal and replacement due to infection risk. 5 days meant the site was vulnerable. Danielle assessed the existing line, a 20-gauge peripheral in the right forearm, the surrounding skin slightly red. "I'll get a fresh one in for you right now," she said. "That's not something we want to push past the 72-hour window." She gathered her supplies with practiced efficiency. Alcohol swab. Tourniquet. 18-gauge angiocath needle. Sterile gauze. Saline lock. Everything arranged on the sterile field in the exact order she'd used them. Her hands moved through the preparation without conscious thought, the economy of motion that came from repetition under high stakes. She was tying the tourniquet around his upper arm when Whitmore's entire body went rigid. "Where did you learn that?" His voice was sharp. Not a question. An interrogation. Danielle's hands didn't falter. She swabbed the insertion site with the alcohol prep, watching the skin darken slightly, reading the vein before she touched it. "Learn what, Captain?" "That tourniquet technique. The way you're prepping the field. That's a Sanjin cut-down for setup." His eyes were locked on her hands now, studying them like they were a classified document. "I've seen that done exactly once. By a combat medic under fire in Helmand Province. Nobody else uses that technique stateside. Where the hell did a civilian nurse learn to prep a field for like that?" The moment stretched. The monitor beside his bed beeped steadily, 103 beats per minute, slightly elevated. Danielle's own heart rate remained controlled, disciplined, the way it had been trained to remain under conditions that this hospital had no name for. She met his gaze with perfect composure, letting one measured breath steady the space between them. Her hands completed the vein assessment. The needle slid in cleanly. The flash chamber filled with blood. The catheter advanced. Everything textbook. Everything precise. "I'm thorough with my training, sir," she said quietly. The needle came out. The saline lock went in. Danielle secured the dressing with sterile tape, her movement smooth and practiced, and without breaking stride she turned toward the door. Professional. Efficient. Just another nurse finishing another task. But in the hallway, 3 steps away from room 4, her hands betrayed her. A single tear escaped down her cheek before she wiped it away without breaking stride. She didn't slow. She didn't stop. She kept walking toward the supply closet where she had exactly 90 seconds before someone would notice she was gone. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Somewhere in the ICU, a monitor alarmed and then silenced. Life and death measured in heartbeats and blood pressure readings. Danielle closed the supply closet door behind her and stood in the dark, her breathing controlled, her hands steady as surgical lasers. She'd spent 3 years building a life where no one knew who she was. And Captain James Whitmore had just asked the question she'd been praying no one would ever ask. The septic patient in Bay 4 was crashing. Blood pressure dropping despite maximum fluid resuscitation, 80/50, and falling like a stone. The monitor's beeping accelerated into a panicked rhythm that made everyone move faster, sharper, like marionettes pulled by the same tightening string. Danielle had her hands on the fall line, running in normal saline wide open, but fluids alone wouldn't save him now. His skin was mottled purple at the fingertips, peripheral perfusion gone, his body shutting down from the inside out. She'd seen this pattern before. Too many times. The sepsis had gone systemic, and his vessels were constricting so hard his extremities were dying first. Dr. Sterling arrived at the bedside like he owned the oxygen in the room. His white coat actually seemed to billow behind him, though there was no wind, just the invisible pressure of his presence, the kind that made residents straighten their spines and nurses check their charts twice. He glanced at the monitor for exactly 2 seconds. Increase the norepinephrine to 0.8 micrograms per kilo per minute, he said. Not a question. Not even a suggestion. Danielle checked the current dose on the infusion pump. 0.6, already high. Already pushing the edge of what the literature supported. She pulled up the monitor screen, scrolled back through the vitals from the last hour. Every increase had narrowed the gap between systolic and diastolic, the vascular space collapsing like a fist closing. His fingers were already losing color. Another 0.2 micrograms, and she might lose those extremities to tissue necrosis. She took one breath. Just one. Professional. Measured. Dr. Sterling, that's above the recommended ceiling. His peripheral perfusion is already compromised. His fingers are mottled, his feet are blanching. Perhaps we should consider. Sterling's head snapped toward her like a gun turret swiveling to lock onto a target. Perhaps when you finish medical school, Nurse Ross, you can have opinions about treatment protocols. His voice carried across the entire ICU unit, loud enough that conversations at the central station stopped cold. He stepped closer, his shadow falling across the medication pump. Until then, I suggest you remember what RN stands for. Repeats numbers and follows orders. Now increase the drip, or I'll find someone who can follow simple instructions. His resident snickered. Soft sounds, but the kind that ripple. The kind that stick in your ribs. Danielle felt heat rise in her cheeks. Not from shame. From something else. Something buried deep that recognized a hunter when she saw one. But she was the prey here, officially, on paper, in the organizational chart that mattered. She took one measured breath, the kind that came from years of holding steady when the world was exploding around her, and reached for the medication pump without another word. Her hands were steady as surgical steel as she adjusted the infusion rate. 0.7, 0.8. The digital display glowed cold and certain. The medication began flowing faster through the line, and the monitor immediately reflected it, blood pressure ticking up, 82, 85, 87. The short-term pressure would improve. That's what Sterling would see. That's what the monitors would show when the board members made their rounds. What they wouldn't see was the trade-off happening at the cellular level. Tissue perfusion collapsing. Fingers dying to save the core. As she turned to dispose of the 4 packaging, a single tear escaped. Just one. She caught it at her cheekbone and wiped it without breaking stride, her face completely composed before she turned back to the monitor. No one saw it. That was the point. The septic patient's blood pressure stabilized at 92/58 for the rest of the shift. Sterling came by once more to check the monitor, nodded with satisfaction, and left without speaking to Danielle again. But the damage wasn't medication anymore. It was institutional. By 6 p.m., his vessels had constricted so severely that his feet turned dark purple from the knees down. By midnight, the tissue was dead. By the next morning, a formal write-up appeared on the unit board, printed on Oak Creek Memorial letterhead and pinned where every staff member would see it coming in for shift change. The paper was cream-colored and official. It might as well have been a scarlet letter. Disciplinary action, Nurse D. Ross cited for insubordination and overstepping scope of practice. Formal warning placed in personnel file. Requires immediate performance improvement plan. Effective immediately. Danielle read it while pulling on her scrubs in the locker room. Her hands didn't shake. Her jaw didn't clench visibly. She simply finished buttoning her uniform, closed her locker with controlled precision, and walked to the break room like she was walking toward any other day. The conversation stopped the moment she sat down with her lunch tray. One by one, the other nurses gathered their half-eaten meals and their thermoses of coffee and made small excuses, got to prep the meds, checking on my patient, promised I'd review the new protocols, and left. They didn't look at her. None of them. The woman who'd helped pull Rachel's car from a ditch 3 months ago. The nurse who'd covered shifts when Jennifer's kids were sick. Danielle had sat with these women through lunch breaks for 3 years, and now they were unwilling to be associated with someone on Sterling's bad list. She ate alone, chewing mechanically, the food tasting like cardboard soaked in disappointment. The break room smelled like heating elements and that particular staleness that only hospital kitchens achieve, microwaved meals and burnt coffee and the ghost of 1,000 people's anxiety. What none of them knew was that Dr. Sterling had spent 15 years at Oak Creek Memorial building relationships with every board member who mattered. Not through competence. Through cultivation. He had photos on his office walls, vacations with the chief financial officer, golf trips with the board chair, his daughter's graduation with the hospital's general counsel standing beside her in the photograph. He had leverage everywhere, woven into the fabric of the institution so thoroughly that you'd have to unravel the entire thing to get him out. He was untouchable. And more importantly, anyone he decided to destroy would be destroyed with institutional efficiency. That afternoon, Dr. Sterling cornered her at the central nurses' station in front of the unit clerk and 2 residents. His timing was theatrical. His audience was necessary. "I've been reviewing your charting, Ross. Sloppy. Incomplete. I'm recommending a 30-day performance improvement plan." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "Shape up or ship out. And I'll be watching. Personally." Danielle met his gaze. Her voice, when it came, was quiet and even. So calm it was almost unsettling. "My charting meets Joint Commission standards, Doctor. I'm happy to have it reviewed by the credentialing committee." Sterling's smile didn't waver, but something flickered in his eyes. Irritation. She'd pushed back. She'd used his own institutional framework against him, citing standards he couldn't reasonably deny. It was a calculated risk. "We'll see how confident you are when the board reviews my report," he said, and walked away. 2 days later, Danielle was changing the surgical dressing on Captain Whitmore's chest wound. His post-op recovery had been textbook normal, bleeding controlled, infection markers stable, vital solid. She'd been assigned to his care since admission, and she moved through the dressing change with the kind of practiced efficiency that comes from having done it hundreds of times. Sterile field. Saline irrigation. Inspect the incision line. Fresh gauze with antibiotic ointment. Secure with hypoallergenic tape. Whitmore had been watching her hands the entire time. His hand shot out and gripped her wrist, not hard, but firm enough that she couldn't pull away without making a scene. "That's a Sanjin cut-down technique," he said. His voice dropped low, sharp with recognition and something else. "Something like danger. The way you're prepping the field. The angle of your scissors. The depth control. I watched you do that exact movement under fire 11 years ago. Where the hell did a civilian nurse learn to prep a field for like that?" The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, suddenly loud. The monitor beeping seemed to accelerate. The entire unit seemed to shrink to the size of this moment, this man, this recognition that could undo everything. Danielle took one measured breath. The kind she'd learned to take when incoming fire was walking toward her position. The kind that came from muscle memory deeper than thought. She met his eyes with perfect composure. "I'm thorough with my training, sir." She gently removed his hand and continued the dressing change, but as she turned to dispose of the soiled gauze, her eyes burned. Not from fear. From the weight of 3 years of invisibility collapsing in a single moment. She wiped her face without breaking stride, her back to Whitmore, her hand steady as she moved to the sink. He was still watching her. She could feel it, the way his gaze tracked her movements, the way his expression had shifted from suspicion to something that looked almost like grief. Later that shift, Danielle found Dr. Sterling at the central station reviewing charts, his reading glasses perched on his nose like a professor's. He didn't look up when she approached. "I've contacted the nursing board about your credentials, Ross. Just routine verification. Nothing to worry about," he said. His tone said otherwise. "I've also spoken with several board members about patient safety concerns. They're very interested in ensuring our standards remain high. And about your recent disciplinary action." Danielle felt the walls closing in. Not visibly. Internally. This was how it happened. This was how institutions crushed people. Not with violence. With paperwork. With phone calls. With the careful, competent application of leverage. That evening, she sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for 20 minutes before she could bring herself to start the engine. The rain was coming down hard, hammering the windshield like applause, like accusation, like the world congratulating itself for being exactly what she'd always known it to be, a place where the powerful protected their own and the rest just tried to survive. Her 14-year-old son would ask about her day when she got home. He would look at her with those observant eyes that miss nothing. And she had no idea what to tell him, not because she didn't know what had happened, but because she didn't know how to explain that sometimes, even when you did everything right, the system was designed to destroy you anyway. That there were men in white coats who owned the rules. That 3 years of invisible work meant nothing when someone with institutional power decided you were a threat. She sat in the dark car, rain drumming the roof like a countdown to something she couldn't see coming, and tried to prepare herself for a conversation she didn't know how to have. The rain had stopped by afternoon shift. Danielle arrived at 2:33 p.m., same as always, badge clipped to her scrubs, her movements precise and economical. 2 days since the write-up had been posted on the unit board. 2 days of silence from the other nurses, of lunch breaks taken alone in her car, of a job that still required her to show up and save lives as if nothing had fractured. She changed into fresh scrubs in the locker room, the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining brushed against her ribs as she moved. A reflex, an anchor. She let her fingers rest on it for a single breath, then released. The ICU hummed with its usual afternoon rhythm. Monitors beeped in their syncopated chorus. Ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythms. Captain Whitmore was in Bay 7, stable from the morning report, his post-surgical complications managed, his labs acceptable, his mood improved. He'd asked about her when she wasn't there. The charge nurse had mentioned it with a kind of pity that burned worse than mockery. Danielle entered the bay at 3:15 p.m. and immediately noticed something was different. Whitmore's breathing was audible, a raspy, labored sound that pulled from deep in his chest. His oxygen was at 98% on a pulse oximeter, but something in the data was lying. She'd learned long ago in Sanjin that sometimes the instruments told you one story while the patient's body told you another. She approached the bed and watched him breathe. His color was wrong. Not the obvious cyanosis, not yet, but a kind of grayness around his mouth that meant his body was already demanding more oxygen than his lungs could deliver. She checked his vitals on the monitor, oxygen saturation 98. Heart rate 119. Blood pressure 142/89. She reached for the pulse oximeter probe and repositioned it on his finger, watching for a lag in response time. When the numbers updated, they dropped like a stone. 92%. Then 88. Something was very wrong. "Captain." Her voice was level, conversational. "How's your breathing?" He looked at her with eyes that were already starting to show the panic of oxygen starvation. "Can't catch it," he rasped. "Feels like pressure. Like someone sitting on my—" He stopped, his hand moving to his right side. The gesture was everything. Danielle was already moving. She checked his oxygen delivery, 6 liters through the nasal cannula. She increased it to 15 liters on a non-rebreather mask, watching his face as the rubber seal pressed against his skin. His saturation climbed back to 92, held there, then began its descent again, 90, 88, 86. The decline was not random. It was a pattern, a geometric progression toward arrest. She placed her stethoscope against his chest. His left lung was clear, air moving through the bronchioles with the crisp whisper of normal ventilation. His right lung was silent. Absent. Like trying to hear a phantom limb. Danielle straightened and looked at Whitmore's neck. His jugular veins were distended, pressed outward like they were being filled from a pump that couldn't stop. She placed her eyes level with his chest and looked across the landscape of his sternum. The midline was shifted. Left. His trachea had moved. The entire structure of his thorax had been shoved toward his heart like a fist pushing against a balloon. Tension pneumothorax. The needle decompression flashed into her muscle memory like something that had never actually left, just been sleeping. She'd performed 5 of them in Sanjin, 3 that lived, 2 that didn't. One on a Marine who'd stepped on an IED with his right foot and gotten air in places air should never be. She could still hear the hiss. Danielle hit the code button. The noise was sharp, deliberate, undeniable. Over the intercom, her voice was steady, medical emergency, ICU Bay 7. Attending needed now. Dr. Park arrived within 30 seconds, a second-year resident still wearing the controlled panic of someone who'd had to run from the ER. Behind him came 2 nurses. Behind them came the gathering. Danielle saw through the glass partition as the entire unit crew stopped what they were doing and turned toward the window. 12 faces. 14. More arriving every moment. His saturation is dropping, Danielle said, keeping her report flat and clinical. Right-sided breath sounds absent. Jugular venous distension. Tracheal deviation to the left. His oxygen is 82 and falling. Dr. Park stared at the monitor as if the numbers might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. That's tension pneumothorax. She didn't wait for him to process. He needs immediate needle decompression. Second intercostal space, midclavicular line. Dr. Park's face had gone the color of hospital walls. I should call Dr. Sterling. He's in the OR, but I can get him on the phone. Whitmore's oxygen was 78%. His lips were developing the blue tint that meant his brain was already thinking about shutting down. His hand had gone slack against the mattress. He was slipping. Get him, Danielle said. It wasn't a request. It was the kind of statement that came from somewhere deeper than politeness, somewhere that didn't apologize for authority. Dr. Park fumbled for his phone. One of the nurses moved to start another full line. The other was on the phone to the attending, her voice tight. I don't know where he is, he's in the main OR. No one's seen him. Try Paige. Danielle grabbed the crash cart and pulled it toward the bed in one smooth motion. Her hands already knew what they needed. 14-gauge needle. She swabbed the second intercostal space at the midclavicular line with an alcohol prep, her fingers marking the anatomy by memory, rib, space, rib, so precise she could have drawn you a diagram with her eyes closed. She'd palpated this exact location on a 21-year-old corporal named Martinez, and on a 34-year-old staff sergeant named Quinn, and on the training mannequin before any of them, 10,000 times across a career she'd never claimed. Dr. Park was still stammering into his phone. The monitor was chirping angry warnings. Whitmore's saturation was 74%. His eyes were rolling back. Danielle inserted the needle. The hiss was audible throughout the entire ICU, a sharp, undeniable release of pressure, like someone had opened a valve on a tire running at 50 psi. The sound cut through everything. Through the monitor alarms. Through the voices. Through the ventilator wheeze. Just a hiss, brief and percussive and absolutely final. Whitmore's chest wall moved. He's breathing, one of the nurses whispered. The monitor updated, oxygen saturation 76%. 80, 85. 89, 92. The numbers climbed like a ladder being set against a wall. His lips began to pink. His hand twitched. His eyes refocused, found Danielle's face, recognized what she'd just done. "Vital stabilizing," the second nurse said. Her voice shook. Through the glass, the gathered faces hadn't moved. 12, 14, 16 people standing in absolute silence, watching. The entire ICU crew frozen at the moment of recognition. They'd seen everything. The moment Dr. Park realized he was going to lose a patient. The moment Danielle moved. The moment she became something other than the nurse they'd learned to ignore. Dr. Park looked at the needle taped to Whitmore's chest. Then at the monitor. Then at Danielle. His jaw worked without sound for 3 full seconds. You performed that's practicing medicine. That's outside your scope of," but even as he said it, his eyes tracked to the monitor, where Whitmore's oxygen saturation was now 96% and his heart rate was dropping from the panicked 142 to something almost reasonable. "You just saved his life." Danielle didn't respond. She was already checking the needle placement, already confirming the breath sounds on the right side, still absent, still air in the pleural space, but no longer compressed, no longer collapsing his lung. The tension was released. The pressure was gone. He could breathe again. "Get chest surgery," she said to the first nurse. "We need a chest tube and imaging." "Stat!" The nurse nodded and moved. The second nurse was already calling for supplies. The crisis had the strange quality of having passed completely. One moment it was a code, the next it was a procedure, the next it was just medical care moving through its necessary sequence. But then the voice came through the intercom, and everything went still again. "Where is Dr. Sterling?" The question cut through the unit like something with teeth. "What happened in Bay 7? I want a full report in my office in 5 minutes, and I want to know exactly who touched my patient without physician authorization." The room had gone so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming. Dr. Sterling was in surgery. He should have been unavailable. But his voice on the intercom was perfectly clear, perfectly present, and perfectly aware that something had happened on his unit that someone had decided to do without waiting for his permission. Through the glass, Danielle saw the gathered faces turn from her to the speaker, tracking the source of the voice like a jury turning to watch the verdict being read. She removed her gloves in one smooth motion, stepped away from the bed, and met Dr. Park's eyes. He was pale, his jaw working. He knew what was coming. Everyone on the unit knew. You didn't question the hierarchy at Oak Creek Memorial. You didn't perform procedures outside your scope. You didn't save a patient's life in a way that made a doctor look slow. Danielle was already moving toward the door when Captain Whitmore's hand caught her wrist. His grip was weak but intent, and when she turned, his eyes were clear, clearer than they'd been in 2 days. "That was a Sanjin technique," he said, his voice barely audible. "You just did what you did in the minefield. With the same hands." "The same." She didn't let him finish. She extracted her wrist gently, gave his hand a single squeeze, and walked out of Bay 7 into a corridor full of staring faces. Every person on the afternoon shift had heard Sterling's voice. Every person knew what she'd done. Every person understood the calculation. She'd saved a patient's life, and in doing so, she'd broken the one rule that mattered most at this hospital. Never make the attending look bad. Never question the hierarchy. Never use your training when you weren't supposed to have it. The walk to Dr. Sterling's office took 47 seconds. She counted them. Sterling's office took 47 seconds. She counted them. The walk from Bay 7 felt like moving through water, each step deliberate, each breath measured, every muscle locked down tight. Around her, the ICU hummed with the ordinary sounds of recovery, ventilators cycling, monitors beeping their steady rhythm, the soft whisper of oxygen flowing through tubing. Captain Whitmore's oxygen saturation had climbed to 94%. His color had returned. His breathing, though still labored, no longer carried the panic of a drowning man. The hiss of air she'd released from his chest cavity had bought him 11 more years of life. Maybe more. That was what mattered. But it wouldn't matter to Dr. Sterling. She could see him through the glass partition of his office, already there, still in his surgical scrubs, his face the color of raw beef. Beside him stood Mr. Donnelly from the hospital board, his expression unreadable, and Mrs. Chen, whose jaw was tight as a wire. They'd been on a routine unit inspection. Wrong place. Wrong time. Right witnesses for what was about to happen. Sterling didn't wave her in. He simply stared, his eyes like hot coals, waiting. Danielle closed the office door behind her. The sound of it clicking shut was final in a way that made her chest go tight. She'd heard that sound before, in a different life, in a different country, when extraction teams sealed hatch doors before pushing off from shore. But extraction meant going home. This felt like the opposite. Did you just perform a needle decompression? Sterling's voice was ice wrapped around a razor. Yes. One word. Steady. Level. The voice of someone who had held her composure while blood pooled around her boots in a phi-base clinic. The patient had a tension pneumothorax. His oxygen saturation was 74% and dropping. The attending physician was unavailable. His trachea was shifting. He was going to die without intervention. You performed a medical procedure, Sterling interrupted, standing now, his knuckles pressing white against his desk. A procedure that requires a physician's license. Do you have a medical license, Nurse Ross? No, but... Do you understand what you've done? He turned to the board members, his voice dropping into that tone he used when he wanted to sound reasonable while describing something unconscionable. This is exactly what I've been documenting. Dangerous overreach. Practicing medicine without a license. She could have killed this patient. His hands were trembling. Not from fear. From rage. I've warned administration about scope creep on this unit. And now we have concrete proof. The resident, Dr. Park, had followed them to the office. He stood in the doorway, his face flushed. She saved his life. I was there. Captain Whitmore was coding Anne. Sterling silenced him with nothing but a look. A glance. That was all it took. The young doctor's mouth closed like a trap. You're dismissed, Dr. Park. We'll discuss your role in this later. Park's jaw clenched. For a moment, Danielle thought he might fight. Then he turned and left, his steps angry on the tile. Sterling turned back to Danielle. Sit down, he said. She didn't sit. His face darkened. I said sit down. I'll stand. The simple refusal hung in the air like a gunshot. Sterling's breath came faster. He straightened his spine, trying to recover the authority that her composure had just taken from him. This was the moment she understood what she'd truly cost him, not respect, but the illusion of it. She'd exposed the thinness of his power, revealed it as something built on fear and institutional position rather than anything he'd actually earned. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Mrs. Chen said quietly, her eyes narrowing as she studied Danielle. That's a Navy rank. The words landed like shrapnel. Danielle's breath didn't change. Her expression didn't shift. But inside, something fractured. The wall she'd built 14 years ago, the one that had kept her hidden, safe, erased, developed a hairline crack. Sterling didn't wait for an answer. He moved forward with the speed of a man who smelled blood in the water. Effective immediately, you are terminated for cause, practicing medicine without a license, violating scope of practice, and patient endangerment. Security will escort you from the building. You have 15 minutes to collect your belongings. Each sentence was a hammer blow. You're fortunate I'm not pressing criminal charges. Danielle took one measured breath through her nose. She wanted to scream. Wanted to explain. Wanted to tell him that she'd spent the last 14 years of her life erasing herself so completely that the government itself had declared her dead and buried. She'd taken a name that wasn't hers. Built a civilian life from papers and references that only partially existed. And she'd done it all because she was ordered to. Because classified operations required classified people, and when those operations ended, those people were supposed to vanish. Instead, she said, "Captain Whitmore is alive because of what I did." Sterling leaned back in his chair, his face settling into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The smile of a man who'd just realized he'd won. "Captain Whitmore is alive despite what you did. You're lucky I'm not calling the police myself." The security guard was already there, waiting in the hallway. James, his name was. He looked uncomfortable. He'd worked at Oak Creek for 8 years and had always nodded at her in the break room. Now he couldn't meet her eyes as he handed her a cardboard box. White, cheap, the kind used to hold medical records. Inside were her personal items, the small photo of her son that had sat on her locker, a pair of compression socks, the trauma shears with her initials engraved on the handle. The shears. That had been a gift. Years ago. Before the erasure. Before Sanjin. Before everything went wrong. She walked through the ICU one final time. The nurses at the central station suddenly became very interested in their computer screens. Nobody made eye contact. Nobody said goodbye. The write-up Sterling had posted still hung on the bulletin board, documentation of insubordination and scope violation, N. Ross, RN. Someone had circled her initials in black pen, as if marking a target. Danielle didn't pause. Didn't look back. She walked toward the exit like she'd walked out of 100 crisis zones, head level, shoulders steady, the cardboard box held like it contained something other than the wreckage of her invented life. The parking lot was humid, heavy with Raleigh heat. Cicadas sang in the trees, a sound like machinery winding down. She sat in her car for exactly 3 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, and let herself breathe. Then she drove home. At 3 p.m., her 14-year-old son found her at the kitchen table. Still in her scrubs. The cardboard box beside her on the floor. Her face wet. Tyler stopped in the doorway. He'd never seen her cry. Not once. Not when he was born. Not when her father died. Not when she told herself every morning in the mirror that she was dead, that Danielle Ross was a ghost wearing a nurse's uniform. "Mom." His backpack slid from his shoulder. "Why are you home early?" She couldn't find words. How could she explain that the person he thought his mother was had just been erased by a man who feared her? How could she tell him that every carefully constructed detail of their life, the apartment she'd chosen specifically because it was close to the hospital, the job she'd taken under a false name, the civilian existence she built from nothing, had just collapsed in the time it took to place a needle between 2 ribs and release the pressure that was killing a patient? How could she explain that the Navy had ordered her to disappear in 2012, had scrubbed her record so thoroughly that officially she'd never existed, and that she'd followed that order perfectly until the moment she couldn't anymore? "Mom, what happened?" She reached for him but couldn't find her voice. The box sat on the floor like an accusation. Inside it, the trauma shears caught the afternoon light filtering through the kitchen window, the engraved letters glinting, DCR. Danielle. Combat. Response. A nickname from her old life. Her real life. The one she wasn't supposed to have anymore. Tyler sat down across from her, his young face trying to process what his eyes were showing him. His mother. Falling apart. In the middle of the afternoon. Still wearing scrubs that smelled like antiseptic and failure. "What happened, Mom?" She shook her head, unable to explain, unable to speak, because to explain would be to admit that everything she built to protect him was built on sand. That senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, decorated combat medic, 3 Navy Crosses, 2 Bronze Stars, a Purple Heart earned by bleeding on foreign soil, had been systematically dismantled by a surgeon's ego and a 14-gauge needle. That tomorrow, or the day after, when he asked again where she worked, she wouldn't have an answer. The hospital board convened at 7 in the morning, before the first shift change, before the coffee carts arrived in the hallways. Dr. Sterling was already there when Mrs. Chen and the other board members filed in, his presentation binder stacked like armor on the mahogany table. He'd spent the night assembling documentation, Danielle's performance reviews, disciplinary write-ups, incident reports, all arranged in chronological order to construct a narrative of insubordination and dangerous overreach. His voice was controlled, professorial, the voice of someone who'd spent 15 years making these people nod and agree. He was 3 slides into his prepared remarks when the conference room door opened and a 14-year-old boy walked in carrying a shadow box. The silence was immediate. Absolute. The boy was tall for his age, with his mother's steady eyes, but his hands were trembling. Not from fear, from rage carefully contained. He walked to the table and set the shadow box down in front of Mrs. Chen with the deliberate precision of someone who'd rehearsed this moment 100 times. His voice shook but didn't break. "Mom, they need to see these." He opened the shadow box. The medals caught the fluorescent light like starlight. Bronze stars with Valor ribbons. Navy crosses in their presentation cases. A purple heart still in its original packaging, untouched. Below them, arranged with perfect reverence, 3 more medals that made the board members lean forward. The boy reached into the jacket lining, the same worn navy jacket that hung on Danielle's bedroom chair, the one she never spoke about, and extracted a faded unit patch. Tan and brown, weathered beyond recognition except to those who knew what to look for. Naval Special Warfare Combat Medical Team. Sanjin Valley. The room didn't just go silent. The room held its breath. A nurse from credentialing, a woman named Harris who'd worked at Oak Creek for 11 years, stood with a classified file in her trembling hands. The file had arrived that morning, a special courier delivery, marked for immediate review. Mrs. Chen had authorized it. Harris read aloud, her voice cracking on each word. Bronze star with Valor. Pause. Another bronze star with Valor. Her hands were shaking. 3 Navy crosses. 2 purple hearts. She looked up from the document, tears streaming down her face. This isn't a nurse's personnel file. This is a combat record. Captain Whitmore had insisted on attending despite his still healing surgical wounds, despite the pain that made breathing difficult. He sat in his wheelchair in the corner, fully uniformed, medals on his dress whites like a monument. When the boy finished, when the last medal lay exposed on the polished wood, the captain straightened in his chair. The movement took visible effort. He looked directly at Danielle, who stood in the doorway with her hands at her sides, and spoke in the clipped precision of a man accustomed to giving orders that didn't require explanation. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Not a question. A confirmation. An acknowledgement. A salute without moving. The conference room door opened again. Commander Derek Hayes walked in wearing civilian clothes, jeans, a navy hoodie, and the bearing of someone who'd seen things that changed how you held yourself. He was broad-shouldered in the way that came from carrying other people to safety. He carried another folder, thicker than the first. His voice was calm, almost conversational, which made each word hit harder. Senior Chief Ross carried 5 wounded operators through a minefield under direct fire. Performed field amputations with a combat knife because her surgical suite was a ravine and the medevac was still 40 minutes out. He turned a page. Held a trauma bay alone for 11 hours until extraction arrived. No backup. No relief. The kind of composure that comes from having already survived the worst that war can offer. Dr. Sterling's face was losing color, draining like someone had opened a valve. His hands, which he'd placed on the table with calculated confidence, were now gripping the edge hard enough to turn his knuckles white. Hayes continued with the cadence of a briefing. I served with Senior Chief Ross in Sanjin. Every person in this room should understand what that means. It means that the woman you just fired, the woman you publicly humiliated for questioning your judgment, was trained to make life-and-death decisions in environments where there is no backup, no protocol, no chain of command asking for permission. He paused, letting that settle. She didn't violate your protocol. She was operating on training that makes your protocols look like suggestions written on a whiteboard. The door opened a 3rd time. 2 FBI agents entered, moving with the unhurried efficiency of federal law enforcement. The lead agent, a woman named Reeves, addressed the room without preamble. Senior Chief Ross's military records were classified and sealed due to her role in a classified operation in 2012. A high-value target recovery in Sanjan Valley that directly resulted in intelligence preventing 2 major attacks on coalition forces. She laid out a document. Her termination triggered an automatic review protocol for sealed personnel. That review concluded this morning. Her service is being declassified. Her record is being restored. The Navy has requested that Oak Creek Memorial formally acknowledge her service and reinstate her employment with full remediation. The silence stretched like pulled taffy. Danielle stood in the doorway, her posture unchanged, her breathing steady, but her eyes had shifted from nurse to senior chief, from civilian to warrior, visible in the way light seemed to move differently around her. By the 5th medal, by the time Hayes mentioned the minefield and the knife and 11 hours of solo trauma medicine, Dr. Sterling had stopped breathing normally. His face was the color of raw meat. His jaw worked silently. When Mrs. Chen spoke, her voice carried the weight of institutional authority finally correcting its course. After reviewing all evidence, the board has determined that Senior Chief Ross acted appropriately in an emergency situation. Her termination is rescinded, effective immediately, with full back pay and benefits. We are also launching a comprehensive review of personnel practices under Dr. Sterling's supervision. She turned to look directly at him. Doctor, you are suspended pending the outcome of that review. Sterling stood, his chair scraping backward with a sound like a scream trapped in machinery. You can't. I have surgical privileges, patients scheduled next week, contracts. His voice was too loud now, the controlled professor gone, replaced by something desperate and fracturing. This is a witch hunt. This woman, she violated protocols, she endangered patients. She saved a patient's life, Donnelly, the board chairman, said quietly. In an emergency. Using training you don't possess and couldn't begin to understand. The door opened again. Security. The same guard who'd handed Danielle the cardboard box yesterday, a former Army sergeant named Williams with careful eyes and a permanently neutral expression, appeared with an identical box. He set it on the table in front of Sterling without ceremony. Williams's voice was barely above a whisper, which somehow made it more final than any shout. I believe you know the way out, sir. Sterling's hands were shaking now. The trembling wasn't restraint, it was the physical collapse of a man watching his entire structure of power dissolve like scaffolding in a fire. He took the box. The walk to the door felt longer than it should have, the ICU beyond suddenly full of nurses and residents who found urgent reasons to study charts, to adjust equipment, to not meet his eyes. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent song. His reserved parking space was already being repainted when he reached the lot. 6 months later, someone spotted him at a strip mall in South Raleigh, behind a folding table outside a discount furniture store, wearing a polo shirt with an insurance company logo. Selling supplemental health policies to people who barely looked at him. His hair had gone completely gray. His posture had collapsed into something smaller, more fragile. Inside Oak Creek Memorial's newly renamed Captain Whitmore Trauma Center, the dedication ceremony had drawn press, hospital staff, and 3 admirals in full dress whites. Danielle stood in her own dress uniform, her son beside her in his junior Rotk dress blues. The painting showed her in Sanguinera fatigues, medical bags slung across her shoulders, the mountains of Helmand Province rendered in watercolor behind her. The plaque read, Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, USN, Courage doesn't ask permission. It simply acts. Captain Whitmore gave the official remarks, his voice steady and strong enough to fill the auditorium. This woman saved my life twice. Once in this hospital, once through her actions that protected brothers-in-arms who went on to have families, build careers, do good in the world. He paused, looking directly at Danielle. True class is what you do when the lights go out. When no one's watching. When the only witness is your own conscience. The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes. If you've ever been underestimated by someone with a title, if you've ever questioned whether the quiet person in the room might know something the loudest person missed, hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling us about a time you stood up to authority and won. And if you know someone who needs to hear that real power doesn't announce itself, share this with them. The world needs more senior chiefs.